Hello, my name is James Walker, and I'm the co-founder of the Atheist and Christian Book Club, a monthly gathering of both believers and skeptics who respectfully discuss important books from both perspectives. I'm an evangelical Christian and also president of Watchman Fellowship, a Christian apologetics organization focusing on interfaith evangelism. Our upcoming book club is going to have a special guest, Steve McRae, who is the host of the Non Sequitur Show. And Steve has been kind enough to join us right now to be able to talk about our subject matter. We're not going to have a book this month, so this is going to be replacing the book. We're going to have an interview here with Steve, and our topic is going to be agnostic epistemology. How do we know what we don't know? Steve, thanks so much for joining us.
Oh, thanks. I'm honored. And by the way, I love that title. That is a really good title. Did you come up with that?
Yeah.
That was good. That's
really the more we got into it, the more I realized, well, that really is exactly what we want to talk about. Not just a catchy title, but it goes in the direction we want to go in. And so let me start with this. How would you define the word epistemology? When we say epistemology, what are we talking about?
Well, epistemology basically is a branch of philosophy, and it deals with the how do we know things about knowledge. And to me, more specifically, it's more how do we differentiate between what we know, what we believe, and what is mere opinion, because those are vastly different things. So when somebody says something, I have an opinion, or it's unjustified, as opposed to I know something to be the case, epistemology gives us the tools in order to make those distinctions between those categories.
Yes. Yeah. Now you're going to be here not by video conferencing, but actually in person. That's going to be.
I'm going to be in town. Yeah, we're flying there. Yes.
That's going to be the first Friday of January. We're going to have a meal at 6:00, free meal, and then we're going to start the club right at 7. We'll be live streaming it on Facebook Live. But those who want to come in person, if they go to our website at atheistchristianbookclub.com, they can RSVP. And we will have a place for you. Steve, I'm expecting this one to be packed out, standing room.
Really?
Yeah,
I know the guests you've had before. You've had Aaron Raw, Dr. Carrier, Bart Ehrman. Yeah. I know all of them. I've never.
We've not had Bart Ehrman here.
You haven't had Bart Ehrman?
We'd love to have him here, but we haven't had him here yet. But
okay, let me make that happen. I got connections to him. He's on my Facebook page. We'll see what happens.
Yes, we did contact him. We've done 2 of his books, and he politely declined. And I know how busy he is, so but.
That's too bad. I would have liked to listen to him.
Yes, but we have had on the Christian side Gary Habermas. We've had.
I remember you saying that. Mm-hmm.
Sean McDowell. We've had some well known as far as the Christian circles, and you're pretty well known in the atheist circles. And so
I'm not necessarily that's a good reason, a good thing or not, that I'm known in various circles.
Or it's like I like to be called, world famous locally. So
yeah, exactly.
But let me ask you this. I think this is kind of important for our whole topic that we're going to be dealing with at the book club. You identify as an agnostic and not as an atheist. Why is that?
I identify as agnostic because it actually conveys to the person my actual position. So if we want to know what your position is with respect to what's called the ontology of God, or the existence of God, or the being of God, whether God exists or not, by saying I'm agnostic, it tells a person that I have no stance whether I believe that God exists or I believe that God does not exist. I do not take a position on it either way. I'm still evaluating one way or another, and I haven't reached a conclusion yet whether I am justified to say I believe God exists or I believe God does not exist. So the agnostic is that position that's saying I don't have a position on the topic. I've suspended judgment on it.
It's not just that you don't want to make a stand. You just say that actually philosophically, cognitively, you really have not come to that position, right?
Yeah, I mean, I was a non-believer before I became a theist, and I'm back to non-believer. But a lot of the atheists, they have very similar positions. They just say they do not believe God exists. They don't go so far to make a positive position on that, and they say they believe God does not exist. So they're in the same stance as I am. They're just some of them is labeled as something else, but in philosophy, that would be construed what's called normatively, or as the case may be, as agnosticism.
Yeah, well, even Richard Dawkins doesn't. I don't hear him anymore saying there is no God. He says there probably is no God. So he's dealing more with probability.
Yeah, I got a copy on me. I think that's kind of I've read Dawkins stuff, and I did a little thing on his scale, and I think he's been a little Weasley there, in my opinion. because all these things are probabilistic arguments. When we say I believe something, we're dealing with probabilities of how much confidence we have that our position is true. So it seems to be redundant to say, well, it's probably more likely God exists, or probably more likely that God does not exist, because you're just saying it differently. You're relating your belief and trying to quantify it. That's all. But if I say something like it is vastly more likely that God exists, that's probably going to convey to somebody I'm a theist, because that's the same thing as basically saying I am convinced that God exists.
Yeah. About maybe a year or two ago in the book club, we dealt with a book called There Is a God by Anthony Flew. And Flew was one of the maybe leading academic philosophical atheists of the 20th century. He's deceased now. But he, towards the end of his life, changed his position and believed there was a God. That was his book explaining why he shifted his position on that. He wasn't a Christian, by the way.
He became a theist.
But it was still a remarkable change of position. And because we obviously couldn't interview him for the book club because he was deceased, what we did do is bring in by video conferencing Gary Habermas, who had debated him numerous times and become very good friends with him, and talked to him. Of course, Flew himself kind of pioneered the no true Scotsman fallacy. He also was kind of well known for arguing the default position should be atheism, and that only if you had sufficient proof otherwise, then you should consider theism or some other position, even deism. So he had argued initially that there was no burden of proof. So I want to talk to you about this whole idea of atheism and the burden of proof. Most of my atheist friends tell me that they bear no burden of proof for atheism, because they think that they're not making a claim that needs to be defended. Atheism is not making a claim, they argue. Instead, it's actually the absence of a claim. Steve, you're somewhat controversial in atheist circles. From what I can read, I don't think you would deny that. That's what I watched on video. You're somewhat controversial.
Yeah, I'm not even going to try to deny it any longer. I guess I am controversial.
Because I don't say that negatively, but
no, I don't think it negatively.
Argue that atheists do have a burden of proof. Now, why is that?
All right. Well, a couple things I want to address, because you had mentioned Anthony Flew. Anthony Flew in 1972 wrote a paper called The Presumption of Atheism. It wasn't well received. He was promoting negative atheism, but in his paper, he did admit that normatively, the understanding of atheism is a positive position. His argument was try to say that we should change it to a better understanding of having a negative position of it, just merely not having the belief itself. There's a professor named, I think it was a professor, but Dr. Burgess Jackson. He wrote a paper called Rethinking the Presumption of Atheism, International Journey of Philosophy of Religion. And he really just annihilated Flew's argument. So I recommend anybody who wants to see why Flew's argument wasn't really received very well. He did a really good job on kind of dismantling his actual argument. But Flew did recognize that atheism is understood most commonly as the position that God does not exist. But as far as the burden of proof, I think there's a misconception of what people have when they hear the word burden of proof. That comes from a legal term. That comes from onus probandi, which is basically the onus to show cause or evidence for your position. And in epistemology, it's a little bit different. It's actually how are you justified to hold a particular belief, right? So when we say, what is your burden of proof for why you believe something? What we're asking is not so much, hey, here's some mathematical proof, or here's some evidentialism, or here's some empirical evidence. What they're asking for is, why do you believe what you believe? What's your reasoning? That's your burden of proof. And so when somebody says, well, I believe God does not exist, you say, well, why do you believe that? What's your justification? When a theist says, I believe, or atheist says, I don't believe, or believe, it doesn't really matter. Any position you have requires some kind of reason why you hold that position with respect to that proposition in order to be justified.
But you've experienced some pushback to that. I mean, that sounds reasonable to me, but is there a tendency amongst many atheists to not want to bear that burden of proof, maybe? Yeah,
I think it's a narrative a lot of atheist online activists put out, even though like other people, like you've had Richard Carrier on. I know Richard pretty well. I was going to have dinner with him a couple months ago. But he actually accepts that atheists have a burden of proof. His argument is that they've already met it, that they've already met their burden of proof. Therefore, they don't really have to do any more work. I fundamentally disagree with him on that, but he does recognize that atheism has a burden of proof. So when I get the pushback, It's basically a lot of people not either not wanting to do the work to justify the position, or B, not knowing how to. And so I think they take kind of the easy way out by they just say, hey, well, this group over here says I'm not required to have a burden of proof to justify my belief. But they're not the philosophers. They're not the experts in the field saying that you do. They have a very small group that says, this is how we look at this. And if you're in that group and you want to utilize that kind of terminology, you want to utilize that kind of framework, that's fine. But you can't apply that to the entire body of philosophy, right? And that's what they think that they try to do. So in philosophy, generally speaking, if you want to have a belief and be rational to hold it, you need to have in your own mind why you hold it, that belief. It's not to somebody else, it's to yourself why you believe it.
Okay, well, Steve, that brings up a good point. Then, on of course, agnostic, you have that Greek gnosis, or knowing, knowledge, and then we put an alpha in front of it, it negates it, so you don't know, basically. So would you describe yourself as being an agnostic in the sense of just knowing about the existence of God, or are you somewhat agnostic about all knowledge? Can we know anything? In your
position? I think that's an etymological fallacy to do that, though. That's not the way the word agnosticism came about. It came about, as you know, from Thomas Huxley, and he wanted a term that kind of reflected his actual position. And so when somebody says they're agnostic, there's three different uses for it. And the most common, which people understand it, is not dealing with knowledge, not dealing with what's called a normative epistemic principle that Huxley would have called it. It's dealing with what is your position in relationship to God existing? Do you believe that God exists, or do you hold the belief that God exists, or you believe that God does not exist? That's what the question is asking when you say, do you believe God exists? It wants to know what your position is with respect to his existence. It has nothing to do with the knowledge. It's not asking you, do you know if God exists? It's asking you about your beliefs.
Here's another way maybe asking the question.
Sure.
When you say you're agnostic, do you mean that you personally don't know, or do you think that the question itself is unknowable by anyone?
Those are two different ways of using the term agnosticism, and it's careful not to equivocate them, because agnosticism
that's why I'm trying to separate the two different ideas.
Agnosticism, with respect to epistemology rather than ontology, is basically saying, can we know if gods exist? Right? Can that knowledge be known? In that aspect, then we would call a temporal, I can't even say the word today, temporal agnostic, or no data agnostic. Basically, I would hold the belief that knowledge is possible if God exists or not, but we haven't reached that ability yet. We haven't gotten to that stage where I think we can say, by using some theory of knowledge, that God does not exist, or God does exist.
You mean all humans?
I'm talking about generalization of all humans. Yeah.
Okay.
Society.
Okay.
Yeah.
So even
I am that,
theist,
but when
you would say, when a theist says, I know there's a God, you would say, you're convinced there's a God, but that's different than knowing.
I kind of, the reason I would say is I'm kind of hesitant to say that they know that is because when I've ever asked a theist why they know that, I've never really, that I recall, seen what their justification is using any theory of knowledge that would justify it.
Which gets back into our question that we're going to be dealing with, was how do we know what we don't know, or do know for that matter?
Right. And there's conditions for that. There's different theories out there. There's actually these theories called theories of knowledge. And if you use a specific theory of knowledge, you can say, hey, I meet these conditions. I am justified to say I know. Like for example, I know that 1 + 1 is 2, right? I know this. It's something that I have knowledge of. To justify it, I can break it down, and I'll probably end up doing it when, when I'm in town, but I'll show that step by step, this is why I can say I know 1 + 1 = 2. But if I say I know aliens exist, I am not justified to have that knowledge, because I'm missing a crucial step in there of the conditions to have knowledge.
Would you say that, from what we're talking about with this idea of epistemology, would you say that maybe most atheists, maybe if not all atheists, maybe could be better classified as agnostic, if you're looking at this idea of actually knowing something for a certainty?
Well, no, because it's not really dealing with knowledge. It's dealing about beliefs. If an atheist says, I believe there are no gods, right, that no gods exist, there would be what colloquially would be called a strong atheist, but in philosophy it's just atheist. But I think a lot of them do hold that position, but then they try to minimize it by merely reducing it down to saying, I do not believe. There is something called negation raising, where you do the opposite. You say, I don't believe, but you're really inferring that you do have an actual belief. But I think it's that I see them do is kind of the opposite. They don't want to have that that burden, just because nobody argues, hey, if I say this is the case, most people will agree you have a burden. So they try to get away from that, and they say, well, I'm not really saying it's the case. I'm just saying that I don't believe, which is a little bit
and when you
measly,
get into this whole faith thing, which I'm sure we'll talk about at the book club when you're here in person, but this whole faith is totally different from saying there is no God, or I know there's no God, versus I don't believe that there's a God. Again, it sounds more like you're dealing with probabilities, or even it has almost religious connotations. We've had long discussions at the book club about what do Christians even mean when they say faith, and some atheists misunderstand that if we have even one bit of evidence, then it's no longer faith that we're dealing with. But
I don't think that makes much sense to me either. I go by the pistis thing. I think that the way that most Christians that I talk to use the word faith is not what other people would think of. Oh, is this blind allegiance, or I'm just accepting it as without evidence. I don't particularly think those are what when I talk to theists, I don't get that impression.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah.
So you wouldn't say that a lot of people that are self-defined atheists are probably more agnostic if you start thinking through the epistemology?
Again, it's hard to go case by case. I mean, I've seen people that actually believe very strongly there are no gods, but then they say, well, I merely lack a belief, kind of thing. And then I've seen the opposite, where people say, well, I'm an atheist, but I merely lack a belief, but I'm probably agnostic philosophically. So each individual has to determine that based upon what their actual beliefs are.
Mm-hmm. So can either atheism or theism be epistemologically consistent?
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, I think that if somebody can justify why they hold a particular position, that's fine. Theists can, atheists can. It's not like one is impossible to justify. I can justify either position, and I don't hold either position. So if I can do it as an agnostic, I sure think that they can. But I think a lot of people are just dismissive, and they'll listen to what somebody's justifications are, and it's fine to poke holes in it. Don't get me wrong. But to say that, oh, well, I'm listening to your justification, and you know what, you don't have a justification. That's not how I operate. I think that we should have a principle of charity and say, okay, these are your justifications. Let's see if they make sense, because to you they do. Therefore, I think you're justified to hold this position. But let's maybe see if your justification still holds up. I think that's the way to approach it for both sides.
Well, you're going to see when you join us, if you haven't been able to go to our website and see some of the past book clubs or catch an idea of what we do. But we really, not that we're perfect at it, but we do try very hard to have respectful conversations. We try to steel man and not strong man. We really want to understand what you're saying. And it's a good argument. We'll try to acknowledge that. If we don't have the answer, I don't know the answer to that, and it's a good question that needs further study. So I'm very excited about you being here. Again, it's the first Friday of January 2020, and you'll be here in person. I'm excited about that. I want to encourage all of our book club to watch this video, to be able to have your questions ready to go for Steve, and look forward to having you with us.
And I'm honored, and I look forward as well. By the way, you promised me coffee. So.
And it will be coffee. We will definitely have coffee for you, and
sounds good.
And and we'll have a meal as well.
Oh,
what would you like? What would you like to eat? We'll get a menu from you of what you care for and stuff. So we will see you at the next book club as we discuss the question, agnostic epistemology. How do we know what we don't know? Thanks so much, Steve.
Thank you.